Henry Porter had always been a restless soul. His mind, a maze of twisted thoughts, was both a blessing and a curse. As a fiction writer, it was his creative playground during the day, weaving intricate tales of horror and suspense. But at night, when the world should be asleep, his restless imagination took on a life of its own, often leaving him sleepless in the dark confines of his home. His little cottage on the outskirts of Garner was the perfect place for a writer. Surrounded by dense woods and far from nosy neighbors, it provided the solitude he craved during the day. However, the same isolation became his curse at night. With only the whispering wind and the distant hooting of owls for company, his mind wandered to darker places. One particular story he had been working on had been haunting him more than others, having obsessed over it for months. Titled Dark Days, Restless Nights, the story was about a creature from a parallel plane of existence, fueled by human imagination and fears. The small, maleficent being lurked in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to break through the thin veil separating its world from our reality. Henry described the creature as being incredibly nimble, reddish in color, with gnashing teeth and claws that could rend flesh from bone in seconds. It wasn't just the story that troubled him, but the character he had created as its protagonist. This character was a mirror image of Henry himself, trapped in a downward spiral of paranoia and anxiety. The story's premise was that as the protagonist's mental state deteriorated, the creature grew stronger, feeding on his despair, inching closer to crossing over into the real world. What he struggled with most was coming up with a suitable ending, unsure if the protagonist would survive or succumb to his monster, releasing it into the world. Either way, he felt strongly that he needed to finish, at least for the sake of his sanity. As the months dragged on, and Henry struggled to put the finishing touches on his tale, his nights became a living nightmare. He would lie in bed, his mind churning with the vivid imagery of the story. He could almost feel the creature's hot breath, or hear its claws scraping against the bedroom door. One especially restless night, as Henry lay in his bed, bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight, he heard it, a faint scratching sound, like claws against wood. His heart raced, and he snapped on the bedside lamp, flooding the room with light. But nothing was there, just the pale blue walls and the familiar clutter of his belongings. He sighed in relief, convinced that it was just his overactive imagination, spurred on by insomnia, that was playing tricks on him. After all, he hadn't slept properly in days. It was natural for his mind to conjure phantoms in the dark. He turned off the light and tried to calm his racing heart. Struggling for more than an hour to get back to sleep, he was finally about to drift into an uneasy slumber when he heard it again, louder this time, a scratching at the bedroom door. His eyes shot open, and he sat up in bed, his gaze fixed on the door, his knuckles white as he clenched the sheets. The scratches grew more frenetic, and Henry could feel the room growing colder, the air thick with dread. He knew this was impossible. It had to be a dream, a hallucination born of sleep deprivation. But the terror he felt was all too real. With trembling hands, he reached for the lamp and switched it on. The room, of course, was empty. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to confront these irrational fears, to prove to himself that it was nothing but a figment of his imagination. Henry rose from his bed, his bare feet meeting the cold wooden floor. He walked toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The scratching had stopped, but his thoughts told him that the creature from his story was out there, waiting for him. With a deep breath, he flung open the door, ready to face his creation. But the hallway was empty, faintly illuminated by the dim light filtering in from the windows. There was no sign of movement. Doubt began to creep in. Maybe he had truly lost his mind. He turned back into his room, but as he stepped inside, he was greeted by a sight that froze his blood. There on his writing desk was the open manuscript of his story. The pages fluttered as if caught in a gentle breeze, revealing a horrifying amendment to the page where he left off. In scribbled handwriting that was not his own, was a statement that sent him reeling. It read, "One of us dies at the end." Henry's heart raced, and he stumbled backward, knocking over his chair. Could the creature have truly crossed over, using his own story as a doorway into his world? It was utterly impossible, and he knew that he was more than likely out of his mind. but he couldn't bring himself to accept either option as truth until he knew for certain. If this was really happening, the monster was no longer bound by the confines of fiction. It was here, in his home, feeding on his fear, just as it was in the story. The air in the room thickened, and shadows seemed to dance with malicious intent. As Henry stood there in shock and confusion, a blood-red hand reached from atop the bed, claws slashing furiously at his side, tearing down to the bone. Henry screamed in pain, collapsing to the floor. Panic surged within him as the creature stood before his eyes. It was grotesque, its form shifting and contorting, as if born from the very essence of his darkest imaginings. The gnashing teeth and razor-sharp claws were all too real. Fear paralyzed Henry as the creature moved closer. In a desperate attempt to prove the unreality of the situation, Henry reached out for the manuscript on his desk, hoping to regain control over his creation. However, the creature lunged from the bed with ferocity, tearing at his flesh with its claws. Blood sprayed across the room as Henry fought against the relentless assault. The struggle was gruesome, and the room echoed with Henry's cries of pain. In a surreal and twisted dance, the creature reveled in the agony it inflicted, feeding on the despair it had been conjured from. As Henry's strength waned, a profound realization dawned on him. The manuscript held the key to this nightmare. With a final surge of determination, he flung the monster off of him, managing to grasp the manuscript, his blood-soaked hands trembling. The creature quickly stood and hissed at him. Then, seeing the manuscript in Henry's hands, it recoiled, sensing its own vulnerability. Summoning every ounce of willpower, Henry tore through the pages, ripping apart the words that had birthed this monstrosity. As the paper fragments fluttered to the ground, the creature convulsed, its agonized wails filling the room. Henry's vision blurred with pain and exhaustion. With each tear of the pages, pieces of the creature's flesh were likewise torn away, falling to the floor in sickening bloody clumps until, at last, the entity began to disintegrate before Henry's eyes, vanquished by the destruction of its literary origin. As Henry lay there, fearing he would soon lose consciousness from his own blood loss, the wounds on his body and the dark splashes of blood on the floor began to fade as well, the room gradually returning to normal. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, leaving behind a silence broken only by Henry's labored breaths. Henry pulled himself into a seated position against his desk and stared at the torn remnants of his story. The manuscript, once a vessel for horror, now lay scattered and powerless. The profound weight of his own existential dread had nearly consumed him, but through the chaos, he had discovered the strength within himself to let go. As dawn approached, casting a feeble light through the windows, Henry pondered the lingering question. If this story had taken on a life of its own, could it happen again? The uncertainty lingered, leaving him to grapple with the shadows of his own creations, forever questioning the boundaries between fiction and the tangible world. In the aftermath of that night, Henry was left with a newfound understanding, an acceptance that not every story needed an ending, and some tales were better left untold.